Let's go.
He's the founder and CEO of OneTrust. In 3 years, he has grown the company into the #1 most widely used compliant privacy, security, and third-party risk technology platform. OneTrust is used by more than 3,000 companies across 100 countries. It's powered by over 50 patents, employs over 1,000 people in 8 global offices. So it's kind of a big deal. Our speaker is an Atlanta Business Chronicle Most Admired CEO and the 2019 EY Entrepreneur of the Year in the Southeast. So without further ado, please welcome to the stage founder and CEO of OneTrust, Kabir Barday.
So I do a number of speaking sessions, usually every week, but usually they're at information security and privacy events all over the world. I've actually never done a talk at an event like this where I just get to share my story. But when KP calls you, you can't say no usually. So actually I put together this deck in this session just for today. And it's my first time actually really sharing the story of how I started OneTrust and how it came about. So I actually had a lot of fun putting it together, and hopefully you guys enjoy hearing about it just as much as I had reflecting on it as I put it together. And I think the session that KP put this together, is KP here? Is he in the audience? Or is he out networking? So I think when KP put together the session title, it said, how I built it, 0 to $1 billion in 3 years, or something very dramatic. And a lot of people think about it in terms of the 3 years when the company really was started and really started scaling. And anybody here who's an entrepreneur, has met somebody who started a company, probably knows that there's a lot that goes into it before that 3-year timer starts. And so I thought it'd be interesting for everyone to hear a little bit about how that journey evolved for me and some of the things that were successful for me as well. And KP, you wanted to do Q&A at the end, or am I? Either one, right? We'll see how the time goes. So I'll walk through maybe 4 kind of phases the way I was breaking this down as I reflected on this. The first is kind of, a lot of learning, ideating. So how did I really come up with that idea, and how did I pick the right idea? Launching the company and what that was like, and then scaling. And so starting with a little bit of the learning, I wanted to put up one of the most important lessons that I learned. 1-800-FUN-4ACE. Does anybody know what this is? KP, do you even know what this is? This is a minimum viable product. This is an MVP. Does anybody know that concept of an MVP? So this was the first time I learned what an MVP was. And I saw an ad for a speaking session or a seminar that a guy named Jim Beach was doing in Atlanta. And he was speaking at Georgia State, and I had never heard of what the concept of an MVP was. And this is a guy who was famous for starting a company. I think A stands for like American Computing something. But it's essentially summer courses for students wanting to learn about IT stuff. And this was, probably in the maybe 90s or early 2000s. And he said what he did was he took out an ad in the newspaper, he put up a 1-800 number, and for less than $100, he tested out his idea, which was that people wanted to come to these IT summer classes. And nobody picked up the phone when you called the number. It was just a voicemail box. And when the voicemail box filled up, he knew he had a business. And it was such a brilliant concept, and I'd never even heard about anything like this. I mean, I went to Georgia Tech, I went to, school here in Atlanta, and nobody teaches you stuff like this. And so that was kind of an aha moment for me where, there's a whole nother world out there in terms of how people are thinking about starting companies and these different concepts. And you don't need $1 million to go, launch a, factory or whatever it was. So I started researching and learning a lot and reading a lot, and these were some of the books that really started guiding my thinking on how companies were being started and formed today. And I stumbled across a group in Atlanta called TIE, which was the Indus Entrepreneur. And as part of that group, I met somebody who was pretty influential in my journey that you guys might recognize, although I guess the beard's still there. And I guess you trimmed a little bit for today, KP. But this is where KP really helped me embed myself into that Atlanta startup community. I started doing a lot of the hackathons, a lot of these different things. KP actually signed me up to teach a startup class called TIEX that I didn't even know the content, and I was supposed to teach it. So what a way to learn it yourself. And so really my point is just, there's a lot of kind of learning and process, and I always like the saying, you can't skip steps in starting a company. And a lot of people today, read about the Snapchats or whatever's in the news and think you just kind of graduate college, you have some crazy idea for some consumer app, and you kind of skip every step along the way. But there is a lot of process, and I could talk for an hour about just all the things I learned during that phase of my journey. And that was years and years of just constantly studying, learning, and thinking very methodical ways that companies are able to start today. So then it really came down to, okay, I know that there's this philosophy that you can start with a minimum viable product. You can really start iterating on these companies in a really interesting way. So how do you come up with the great idea? Like, it's a funny question I always get asked, like, how did you come up with the idea? And what is it like Steve Jobs like took a bunch of mushrooms and went in the woods and like inspiration came to him or something? Like, I don't think really that's how it works out for most people. And I took a very intentional approach at it. And I'm sure there are different things that work for everybody. So I wanted to share a little bit of my approach and my journey here. So what I actually did is I went to Costco and I bought a whiteboard. And I put a whiteboard in my bedroom. And it forced me to think every single day when I'd wake up and go to bed and I was at home about writing things down, about what did I experience that day, what are some interesting trends that I'd identified. And by this point, I had taken a job, I had graduated from Georgia Tech, I had taken a job at a company called AirWatch. Has anybody heard of AirWatch? It's, I guess, kind of a famous story in Atlanta. So I joined this company. At the time, it was called Wandering Wi-Fi. They later pivoted into AirWatch, and that company grew very quickly. So I got to be one of the first 50 or so people in that team, and got to really see how enterprises were interacting with IT and mobility and getting exposure to all these different types of things. So what I started to think about is that at AirWatch, that company grew so quickly because it took advantage of some massive trend that was just a tectonic shift that fundamentally opened up new business opportunities. And I knew that you can always anybody can be a businessman, right? Like open a pizza franchise or open a restaurant. But being an entrepreneur and going for something bigger really was a bigger risk and also required a bigger trend. So I start to be really aware and mindful of the mobility trend for AirWatch. What is that trend that's gonna happen in 5 years that I can somehow take advantage of? And I would write things down as I observed them. And this is actually a picture of the whiteboard from my bedroom, gosh, like maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And you can see things in here like what I call the aging Twitter generation, which is essentially as millennials and everybody gets older and you're used to, you can't communicate in anything more than 60 characters. Like when those people age and need healthcare, like, how do you deliver medicine to somebody in 60 characters? Like, what is that going to look like? Privacy regulations is number 2. So I knew from my experience working with companies that something was happening in Europe about privacy. And it seemed to be big, but I didn't really know what it was. And there are a bunch of other things in here, right, that I started to think about. And then I said, okay, what are some specific problems that those different trends might reveal or might expose? And I always broke this down by consumer and enterprise. And so I wrote down a bunch of ideas. The one I decided to work on was circled here. And you probably can't read it. It says, companies are at risk because employees leak data. And the funny thing about it is if you look to the left, you also probably can't read that. But the one to the left says, how do you comply with privacy regulations? Which is actually the better idea, which is what I actually ended up doing. So I was completely wrong when I circled that idea. But it forced me to think. And one of the books I had read that really helped me refine, like, what idea did I want to actually work on, was, I forget if it was a Jim Collins, one of these, BS management books about, people who never started a company writing about how to start a company. But he talked about a concept called the hedgehog concept that I really loved. And he talks about the way to be successful is you kind of find the intersection of what are you deeply passionate about, what can you make money on, and what can you be best in the world at. And that best in the world was the most important thing for me. What I started to think about is what was I unique at that made me different from everyone else. And anybody can like graduate college now and, you know, try to start a company and like do the thing like Yik Yak or whatever. We all know how that ended up, right? But what I felt was unique about me is I had such deep experience with enterprise software because I got to be part of this AirWatch journey. So I said, I've got to do something with enterprise, otherwise it's just a complete failure on what can I be best in the world at. And I learned so intimately how you deliver for enterprise customers, how you install software in an enterprise's firewall, all the change management that it requires, how you manage escalations, all of those types of things that made me so unique that gave me a barrier that somebody just graduating college couldn't do. So I brought all those things together, and then the aha moment came for me when I was actually working with a company when I was at AirWatch. And one of my responsibilities at AirWatch was to work with our biggest customers, the GEs, the Shells, the Procter & Gamble's, and figure out why they weren't adopting the AirWatch software at the time to its full potential. And the AirWatch software, for those of you who don't know, it's in the space called Bring Your Own Device, which is essentially a software that you install on a mobile phone, your personal mobile phone, that you're bringing to work, and you want your IT department to put all your email and everything on your mobile phone, and in exchange, your IT department will install AirWatch on that phone to track, monitor, and make sure that phone is secure. One of the things, not just AirWatch, but all companies in that space could do is read which applications you have installed on your mobile device. Think about what that can reveal about you. Think about the apps that you have installed on your phone. So this can tell who you voted for. Is it Trump or Hillary app? Okay, who voted for Trump? No, I'm not going to ask. There's a gay and straight dating app. There's a Bible app. There's a Torah app. There's a Quran app. There are apps for where your kids go to school, even without seeing inside the app. The funny thing was, when we installed that software on people's devices, they were worried about us reading their email and text messages. It actually wasn't possible to do that. But I would argue it could do much worse, just by knowing the names of the apps you have installed. And it was for a good reason. You want to display that to your IT help desk, that they know if you have, you remember the flashlight app that had the viruses in it and everything that was spying on you? They want to make sure that's not on your phone. So it's for a good reason, and this is where you learn about the unintended consequences of privacy, and that privacy is distinctly different from security. This was a security solution that caused a privacy problem. And guess what? When I'd go to Europe and see why did GE not fully roll out our solution to 300,000 people, they always blame privacy. And so I knew privacy was a thing, but I didn't know what it was. Like, think about what privacy means to you. Privacy to you probably means data breaches. Like, that's not what privacy is, actually. But I knew privacy was something. I didn't really know what it was or what it meant to a company at that time, but I knew it was something that was important and that Europe was, like, somehow cared about it. And what I learned many years later was that the way to describe, I always describe this to Americans, is that privacy in Europe is like gun rights in America. Number one, it's deeply rooted in history. Privacy in Europe is deeply rooted in Nazi Germany and governments mass surveilling populations and using it to kill people. Guns in America are deeply rooted in the revolution and people knocking on your door, and if you don't have a gun, you can't protect yourself. It's a fundamental human right. So in the European Declaration, privacy is a fundamental human right. It's not a fundamental human right in America, but guns are. And everyone else in the world thinks you're crazy for it. And it's actually a competition issue. And so these are things that are so rooted in Europe that regulations had come out to force companies to develop a framework on how to manage privacy. And so this started to codify something I knew was a problem, and there was a framework on how to manage it. And when you look at that framework, there are lots of things companies need to do to manage it. And so I said, okay, let me start a company. And so what was my 1-800 fund for ACE? So this was my 1-800 fund for ACE. I called it OneTrust. I put up a horrible website that I coded myself, and it was essentially a mobile application that you could install on an employee's mobile phone to disclose to them what their company was tracking about them. And this is where I learned the difference between a feature and a company, because this was not a company. This was a nice feature, and actually was a good feature of what AirWatch was doing at the time. So I said, okay, this was interesting learning, but it really should be a feature. So I was still at AirWatch at the time, and I actually pitched this to the executive team. I'm like, hey guys, we should be doing something about privacy. I think we should build this app that can disclose it. So I built it, and I applied for an international privacy award, and I won it. So I won the most innovative privacy technology in the world that year. And I didn't even know that was a thing, and I didn't even know there was like a whole profession around privacy. But again, there was a thread on a sweater that I kept pulling. I knew privacy was something. I knew it was a big trend. I knew it was becoming important. I knew I wanted to do something. So I went to this conference to accept this award, and I sat in on a speaking session by Marriott and by HP, and they were talking about some tool that they had built to help their company manage privacy. And at the end of the speaking session, 300 people in the room, a bunch of people raised their hand and said, how do I buy that software? And they're like, you can't, we kind of built it ourselves. There's nothing on the market. So I was like, okay, I kind of know a little bit more where I need to focus, so I built version 2 of OneTrust. So my updated site based on what I heard in that speaking session. And then what I did is I still didn't fully understand the specific thing I needed to build, but I was closer at this point. So what did I do? I hit the road. So I went on LinkedIn. I looked up all the different membership directories of privacy people all over the world. And what I would do is I would look at where are privacy conferences. And at the time, there was probably about like 15,000 people in the profession of privacy. Today, it's like 500,000. It's just been unbelievably fast growing. And so I looked at like the membership directories. I'd go on LinkedIn, and I'd message the chief privacy officer of all these big companies. This is an actual email I wrote many, many years ago. And this was the chief privacy officer, man, I think of Dell or something. And I just said, hey, do you want to meet? I've got this idea. I'm trying to do something. Do you want to meet? And I did this over and over and over again, and I iterated. And what I learned in this process was that you got to be careful on people saying nice things to you. Because all these meetings, people will be like, it's a great idea. Good job. Keep going. And that's your signal that it's a horrible idea. The question is, are you going to write me a check for it? And until you get a yes, it's a horrible idea. And so that was a really valuable learning. But what I did is I would book Airbnbs. This was an actual picture of one of the Airbnbs I stayed in. It was literally someone's attic. I tried to use the curtain on the window as a hanger, and you can see it, like the completely thing fell down. So the irony is I had no privacy. Everybody could see me the whole time. So I'd stay in crappy places like this, spending my own money, but would meet with people in DC and Brussels and Toronto at all these different conferences. And when you read about customer discovery, this is a concept called customer discovery, which I learned from one of KP's classes, actually. But what KP told me that I think was a little bit wrong was you got to do this thousands of times. You got to do it thousands of times. You only got to do it like 10 or so times, at least in B2B enterprise software, right? Because in B2B and enterprise software, you get a good picture pretty quickly of what you need to do. Maybe with consumers, it's a little bit different. So tens, not hundreds or thousands. You don't have to kill yourself. You don't have to make this a huge barrier. But I talked to all these different companies all over the world. And I learned about what competitors were starting, what was doing out there, what would actually solve this. And that's when I refined the idea to actually be more of a software platform that helps a company operationalize their privacy program. And what that means is you got to track all your data, you got to do risk assessments against that data, and then you got to be transparent about how that data is collected, and you got to give choice. That's like a whole new infrastructure a company needs to install. Just like Salesforce is your CRM and ServiceNow is your IT infrastructure, privacy required a whole new infrastructure that didn't exist, but privacy law, and at the time it was a best practice, but privacy laws were about to make it a requirement. And I read the entire GDPR. Has anybody heard of the GDPR, the European Privacy Law? Everybody's heard about it now. Back then, even privacy people hadn't heard about it. I read the entire 500-page legal thing, and studied it and learned exactly what it required, and then built a software around it. So how do I take that and actually launch a company, right? So I went on a site called AngelList, and I messaged hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, and I said, I'm going to be starting this company. I'm not going to pay you. I'm not going to give you any equity. I'm not going to give you a title. I'm not going to make you a founder. Who wants to come? And that was a very intentional and important thing, because I've read stories over and over and over again of people getting completely hosed by making promises up front. You don't know how valuable these people are going to be. You're going to give them titles that you got to unwind later. You're going to have all these different things. And actually, by being so strong in that message, I wasn't like, that's not the message I wrote, otherwise no one would have ever replied to me, but those are the conversations I had, actually got me a little bit more credibility, to be honest. It made me like very thoughtful, and people were like, okay. And I said, look, if you don't, anybody who helps me now, I'm gonna take care of. And I've taken care of every single person that helped me in that journey, but I said it's hard for me to formalize something now, because when we want to take investment later, they're going to look at the agreements now. It's going to make a messed up, lopsided cap table. Nobody's going to know who's what, and it's going to actually make us less likely to be able to raise money later. So let's figure it out. If you don't trust me to take care of you, then you shouldn't come help me. So that's kind of how I did it. I turned my bedroom into an office, and I moved. I have a tiny little house, and I moved into like a spare closet really upstairs. And this was my old bedroom. You can see the whiteboards in the back. And these were the people that started helping me. And we'd meet Tuesdays and Thursdays and just start coding stuff. And we tried to figure it out. And then I got one lead on the website. The only lead I ever got. I got one lead. I don't know. I still to this day have no idea how they found the website. It doesn't show up in Google. It didn't show up anywhere. I got one lead. And I said, it is my life's mission to close this deal. And so it was a company called Tech Savvy, which is essentially like, they're kind of like a T-Mobile in Canada, but like much smaller, like 400 people, but that's their brand, in a horrible place in Canada called Gatineau, which is very cold and not fun. And I did phone calls, and I jumped on a plane and flew up there. And it was their general counsel, chief privacy officer. And we had started building some platform, but I knew there was 10 different things within privacy that needed to be built. And I didn't know exactly where I needed to start. That was the hardest part for me. That was my torment. I was like, I need to do everything, but where do I start? And so I learned a prioritization game that I learned from being a product manager at AirWatch, where you can essentially write a bunch of features on cards and score them with dollar amounts. You don't score them based on how hard it is to build, but how valuable you think it is. And then you give your customer a set of money. And this was my first customer sitting there. His name's Bram. And I gave him all these different things. I was very transparent. I said, hey, this stuff doesn't really exist, but I'm building it. What features do you want? You have $100 to spend. What would you spend it on? And it got them to be part of the process. They were willing to collaborate. He was really, it was really fun. And if you've read a book called Crossing the Chasm, you learn about the different types of customers in every step of your journey. So again, this kind of goes back to all the learning and academic from 5 years before this, where Crossing the Chasm is your first customer, you're looking for the innovators, right? And so this was a way to find that innovator and to get them to be part of that process. And we went up, and man, we worked hard for this deal. I had no idea how to price it. I just wrote a random number on a piece of paper, slid it over, and oh, by the way, this was a software we designed as a result of it. And I just did this myself in a tool called Balsamic, if you ever used it. It's like a wireframing tool. You just can do it. And for almost a year, all our demos were just Balsamic. It wasn't real software. And people would buy it based on these mock-ups. And he's like, pricing looks good, let's get it done. So KP actually helped me here again. So I was like, KP, I need real office space. I can't really keep doing this in my basement. So KP connected me with this company in town that just laid off a bunch of people. I won't call out their name. But I met with their CFO, and agreed to hot desk all the office desks from the people we just laid off. And we grew from, these were the first 5 hot desks we got. I knew I did not want to be part of, I won't be controversial, but I didn't want to be part of the Atlanta Tech Village or any of this kind of stuff. I didn't want my team to be distracted by other people with very different goals than me. I wanted to do something big, and I felt that not everybody had those ambitious, and I didn't want my people's mind to be cluttered with a bunch of other stuff. So I wanted to really be on our own. So that's why I didn't do the traditional co-working spaces. So I found this. We, by the way, took over their entire floor and 2 floors above it over the next few months. And then we did our first trade show. Our first trade show, this was April. We had quit our jobs by this point, and I'd put every last dollar I had into the company. I'd made a little bit of money off the AirWatch sold for $1.5 billion to VMware, and I made a little bit of money, nothing life-changing, but enough to like bypass an angel round. So I put everything into the company, took out a home equity line, increased all my credit card limits, and started signing up for trade shows and trying to market. And I'm like, this money's gonna last me 2 years easy. As soon as you hire a developer, you're like, shit, this is gonna last me 3 months. So very quickly you realize you gotta start selling, you gotta start doing deals. So we did a trade show, we packed up all our stuff. We actually downsized from the beautiful Airbnb I showed you earlier to an even crappier Airbnb, and we put 2 people in these rooms, and we exhibited at our first trade show as OneTrust. Now, at this show, I'd done all of this on my own until this point with a really solid team helping me, but I'd never asked for money or asked for investors. I actually started working on a pitch deck and started recruiting VCs to start to invest. And I'd gotten a phone call when I was doing this show from the 2 guys who had founded AirWatch and before that founded a company called Manhattan Associates in Atlanta. And I worked for them at AirWatch, John Marshall and Alan DeBerry, if you know them in Atlanta. And they had stepped down from their board position at VMware. And they said, hey, we heard you're up to something. We're in DC. Can we come check out the trade show? And they actually worked the trade show booth with me. These are, like very wealthy guys who don't need to work anymore. They worked the entire booth with me the entire time. And I had never gone to them for help, asked them for money, but they, after the show, made me an offer to be my partners in the business. And the most valuable thing I learned at that time was that who you take money from is the most important thing in that journey at that stage. Because once you can get a term sheet or an offer from one person, that means other people are going to be able to give you money as well. So the hardest decision is who do you pick to take money from? And there's a lot of dumb money and there's a lot of smart money. And I made a decision because they said, it's not just money, but we're going to be full-time helping you and advising you operate. And we're the only people in Atlanta that have done $2 billion companies. And when you do a third company, after doing $2 billion companies, you don't want the third one to be smaller than your last 2. So I'm like, all right, let's do it. And so we rebranded and launched OneTrust June 2016. So that's where the 3 years come from. But again, a lot of work went into getting to that starting point. So that's where we scaled. So within the 3 years, we started investing in intellectual property. We started investing in R&D. We have 73 patents today. We have 450 developers out of our team. We did 2 acquisitions. And we just scaled and scaled, and I was just telling KP I did 1 million sky miles in 3 years. And the key thing, one of the key things that was important as I scaled was the DNA and the culture of the team. And everybody that joins my team at AirWatch goes through the same 1-week boot camp, no matter what role they're in. And I actually teach a culture class myself. It's a 1-hour session. There's lots of things I teach. One of the things in that is a concept of hate to lose versus like to win. And this is probably the single most important cultural thing with my team. Who here likes to win? I like to win. Everybody likes to win. That's the problem. Your competitors like to win. That doesn't make anybody different. That doesn't actually help you win. What matters is people that hate to lose. It's that obsession. It's that control. It's being paranoid about all the different things that could go wrong. It's knowing that when you lose a deal, there's still overtime, and you can win it back. It's listening. It's thinking about what's next. There's all sorts of examples I go through with my team, and it's an absolute obsession and a lack of tolerance for losing, and a hatred of losing that's so deep that when you even get a verbal from a customer and they're like, yeah, we're going to go with OneTrust, we don't speak of it until ink is dry and money's in the bank, because that hatred of possibly losing is so deep, and that drives us to do so much more. And there's so many examples of this that we teach. So within 3 years, we grew from, we have 3,500 customers today. we onboard 250 customers every single month. We just crossed 1,000 employees. We're onboarding 100 to 120 employees every single month, 45% in R&D, 8 global offices all over the world. From a customer perspective, over 120 of the Fortune 500, pretty much the who's who of every brand uses us all over the world. And if you go back to that slide I showed you where those customers I interviewed many, many years ago, every single one of those are my customers today. And that was probably one of my proudest moments because I didn't have those conversations pitching them. I didn't have those conversations asking them to buy something. I just had those to build relationships, get advice. Those are some of the lifelong friends I have in the industry today. They've always helped me along the way. And most of them used some other type of solution or tool that they've since replaced and used mine. And even Marriott and HP, who was that speaking session I went to many years ago, and they talked about the tool that they built. It was their baby. They invested so much money and time into building their own solution. They threw it all out the window to switch to OneTrust. And so a milestone for us was when the Forresters and Gartners of the world, which are analyst companies that essentially define markets, they finally formalized privacy as its own market, its own category. And we largely invented and created the category. When you look at the criteria, we actually told Forrester what should be in it. And that was a special thing. We kind of created an entire market that there are now probably 200, 300 companies in the industry that are following in our footsteps. But you can kind of read in the top right, we are highest in strategy and execution. We beat out our competitors like IBM, RSA, SAP, the combined market cap of over $100 billion in that quadrant that we've beat out. And just about a month ago, we raised one of the largest Series A's in enterprise software history and one of the fastest paths a company has ever gone from 0 to $1 billion valuation. So that's my story. Thanks for letting me share. What do you want to do? Yeah, happy to take any questions. So the yes came for me after I did that game with that customer and getting them, instead of me presenting what I thought the solution was, kind of putting all those options on the table and letting them tell me what they would pay for and what they would pick. And again, this is a little bit unique in enterprise software versus consumer, where like every company in the enterprise thinks they're unique and different. They're like, I'm a healthcare company, I'm special, I'm unique, I'm finance. They're all the same. Like, at least in privacy, right? It's not a verticalized market, it's a very horizontal market. And so when they helped prioritize and build it, I knew it would be consistent with what other people were doing. It might be in a slightly different order. And so getting them to be part of that process, they felt like it was their idea. And the special thing is, when I go to, I could name hundreds of customers that feel like OneTrust was their idea. And we've kind of created a brand and a perception where the overall community of like leaders in this industry feel like this is their company. And that's a really special thing on how we created that brand, by really involving people in that process. Yeah, I mean, in every single one of our presentations, so we have an extremely disciplined, repeatable, highly scaled sales process that is consistent across hundreds of reps I have globally now. And everybody's trained. We have one slide that talks about our commitment to joint success. And it's, look, we're successful if you're successful, customer. And so if you ever need a better price, if you ever need a new feature, like, here's all you need to do. And we're committed to doing it. And it's one thing to work with a company that's committed to doing it. It's another thing to work with a company that has the capacity to deliver on those commitments. And because we have the largest team of R&D, we're the best funded company, we're who you should be working with. And so that's part of our pitch that's very consistent across the board. Yeah.
With your early customer acquisition strategy, when you were first going out and selling and you hadn't had the success you've had today, did corporations require you to run pilot programs with them to kind of show a proof of concept, or did they fully jump on board and buy what you were selling them at that moment?
Sometimes. I mean, we were always very flexible in our contracts. I was never afraid to contractually commit to a certain set of features. When you contractually commit to a certain set of features, you can't recognize the revenue, which doesn't matter at a company like ours. And then one of two things happen. You either build it and they're happy, or you don't build it and they give you more time. So as long as you communicate well along the way, and remember, largely, we were kind of the first to market, so they actually didn't have a ton of alternatives. There were a few competitors that weren't necessarily well respected, and so people were willing to take a little bit of a chance on us. I leaned very heavily on my team's experience. I mean, I have like an amazing team that none of this would have happened without them. I was able to recruit really well. I had built a lot of good relationships at AirWatch that I was able to leverage and recruit. And one of the key things about our pitch in the early days was we didn't talk so much about the product. We talked more about our team and our ability to deliver and the unique perspective we were going to take to the market. And we'd always say, you know, we had a competitor that's been in the market for like 10, 12 years. And we're like, you know, part of what I rehearsed with my team, everybody said in the same pitch, look, sure, there have been companies in this market for 10 or 12 years. But working with OneTrust is less about the past and more about the future. It was like a deeper emotional connection to how we pitched it. And we sold to people who wanted to be part of the future. And again, if you study Crossing the Chasm and think about how you market to the different phases of a market, that's like squarely nailing the innovator in the market. And so that's what we attracted. Now my pitch today is completely different than that. Yeah.
So it takes different skill sets to start a company, raise money, scale a company, run a big company. But you've gone through this process pretty quickly. How do you continually self-assess yourself and say, all right, where is my ceiling? When do I need to bring in somebody because this isn't my expertise? How do you self-assess through that?
Yeah, it's a good question. To me, it's more of there hasn't been like pivot points where I've stopped and said, I need a completely different approach or a completely different person. It's been kind of an incremental, constant evolution and growing. Number one, I have really, really good advisors. So when you have two guys on your team that have started $2 billion companies, have gone through that entire journey, they're able to anticipate and help me. And whenever I'm very, very rarely in Atlanta, and KP knows I flew in from London to be here, which I got my like cool London suit on. But even I'll sit with KP and he'll help me. I mean, we'll have drinks and he'll be like, here are the next 4 problems you're about to have. And so to me, it's just a constant iteration and evolution. It's about surrounding yourself with advisors and people trusting you to execute and raise your hand when like there's something you have. Like, I have no idea how to build a reseller channel. I just have no idea how to do that. And so that's something we're working on right now, and we're looking to hire somebody that has that experience, learning all the lessons learned. And so, like, it's not being shy and afraid to figure out those things. But I would say equally on the other hand, one of the things that was, when I started, when I would hire people with industry and domain expertise, one of the questions I always ask myself is, how do you manage somebody and help coach somebody that knows more than you about their area? And what I realized is they might know more about how to do something at the last company they were with, but very few people have ever worked for a market leader that's the number one in their market that is doing things in such a disciplined and unique way. And that's the coaching and skill set that I bring to the table that's most valuable, that consistency, that scale, that culture, that way of thinking about things, that hate to lose mentality, that just relentless attitude that I'm able to add value across any specific functional areas. And then you just got to trust your sales leaders to do their job. Like the famous saying my advisors always tell me is you don't buy a dog and then bark for it. So you got to let people do their jobs too. One more question. Yes, sir.
How did you convince your early employees to come on board with zero upfront salary or incentive?
Yeah. So I relied very heavily on my experience at AirWatch. And I said, look, I was, the way I gained credibility was, I would say, I was one of the first employees of AirWatch. I got all this experience. I have this unique problem that we've identified. And I'm looking for people that want to join the team. And worst case, like if you want experience building and starting a company, we can work together on it. And if it works out, great. If it doesn't, it's something you wanted to do anyway. So we kind of made it a kind of win-win situation for everybody. And I'd meet people face to face, and they just had to take a chance on me. And so I just kind of built that trust and relationship. And one guy I did have to pay. His wife wouldn't spend the weekends and evenings with me unless I paid him like $1,000 a month, which I ended up doing. But another one was like a student. Another one was like an E&Y engineering manager. They all kept their jobs. They would help me in the nights and weekends, right? So I didn't ask them to go take some big risk. And then when I was doing this deal at Tech Savvy, and again, with that hate to lose mentality, one of the things that I trained myself is don't even talk about the deal. Don't even share that we're about to win it until it's actually done, because I didn't want people to get excited. So I worked, and nobody knew what I was working on or what I was doing. I scheduled a social event for everybody. I think it was like go-karting or something. And I scheduled a social event for everybody. And I knew the biggest barrier to get them to quit and work full-time was their spouse. I know those were the enemies. They all wanted to help, but their spouse wouldn't let them. And so I said, okay, I am a better salesperson than that person I'm trying to hire. So I don't want him to convince his wife or husband or partner. I want to convince them myself. And so I invited their families, their children, everything to this social event. And I had a signed contract that nobody knew about. And I framed every single one, beautiful green frame, really awesome, and got everybody a couple beers. Everybody was having fun. And I said, I got a surprise for everybody. And I handed out these like framed contracts. I was like, everybody's part of this. So their husband, wife, children, they all felt like they were part of the beginning, the starting. And I'm like, this is a sign that we have to go now. So my ask is everybody go home, talk about it, and come join full time. If it's not right for you, absolutely no hard feelings. But now's the time to commit. And because everybody was in it together, it wasn't he said, she said, or anyone convincing. It was everybody sharing in that excitement, and every single one of them quit their jobs and started. I was the last one to quit my job, actually. All right, thank you so much, guys. Yeah.